Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just got into my All-American picks for this upcoming year. A very, very tough group to put together because there's talent all across this country at every single position. So there was not an easy choice to make, I can promise you that. But let's get into the second segment here. And this is a very, very interesting idea and one that I hate with all my heart. I'll be totally honest. A fall transfer portal window would be a nightmare, and for a number of reasons. But it's come up in conversation around a number of different coaching circles and college football circles over the last little bit, and just want to give you guys an update on it, because it's something that has kind of popped up, especially recently over the last couple of weeks, because this is that time of year, right? We're in the middle of a fall camp. Everything's kind of going about business. You know, you're putting the pads on. You're starting to do scrimmages, all that type of thing. With that comes a ton of injuries, and we've talked about a lot of them on here. C.J. Baxter going down, Charles Jagusa going down for Notre Dame, but at the end of the day, there are tons more, and frankly, we're going to cover a lot more in the fall camp intel portion of this show, but at the end of the day, it changes your entire outlook on your season, especially for Notre Dame. They're now starting a true freshman at left tackle, it looks like, and that totally changes the way that you can look at this season and the way that you feel about that first-round matchup, where you can line up Nick Scourton on that side and just say, freshman handle it, and he won't be able to handle it. I'll be plainly honest. Nick Scourton's one of the most special players in the country. So as you look at all these injuries happening around the country, as you look at all of the depth problems that are starting to form around some of the different teams, whether it's Texas or Notre Dame or Oklahoma or Florida, there is a million different injuries and a million different things happening all around the country. And it was something that that is Lincoln Riley, is something that Kirby Smart brought up when he was talking about this, and basically he was kind of bemoaning the future of the sport in some ways, and the future, particularly towards the roster cap that is coming into play, the 105 players at max that you can give a scholarship to, that you can have on the active roster. That is obviously something that is going to make life a little bit tougher from a perspective of depth, from a perspective of making sure everyone's fresh, especially in a 15-game, 16-game, even 17-game season. You definitely have a lot on your plate. There's no doubt about that. And it's definitely something that will be really interesting to kind of watch unfold. The reality is there's so many people that, want to figure this out and want to figure out a better way to have that depth going into the season. The only real way is to make sure that as many guys on your roster are ready. And I think that's something that a lot of coaches have said as you've gotten into this. It's something that coaches are really not in favor of at all when you get into the portal window, but also they're not big in favor of all the different, roster constrictions on their program. So it's a little bit confusing. It's definitely one of those things that'll go back and forth a little bit. As of right now, there are so many coaches that are very aggressively against this. And so I don't think we're necessarily seeing anything right away. But let's say, just a hypothetical, it's a very kind of interesting thing to talk about. And down at Texas, C.J. Baxter just went down, was the leading rusher was the leading returning rusher from a year ago. Very talented sophomore, someone that was likely going to be their starter when week one came around. He goes down, and Texas is sitting there, and they're trying to figure out how they want to combat this and how they want to deal with this. In a world where they could, call up someone, or they could, DM someone on Instagram. It's a weird system. I'm not arguing that, but there is a world for this because the NFL has this every day. The Falcons just signed a couple of players, and they play in a couple of weeks. So it's not necessarily like this is, otherworldly for this to happen, but it definitely would be weird. But there's a world where Texas could call up one of the best running backs at the Group of 5 level, or one of the veteran running backs at the Power 5 level, and say, we got an opening for you to play. We got an opening for you to find a way onto the field and get some really good reps, and maybe they would take that chance. And also, it would add to a really, really interesting conversation when it comes to things like NIL, where you could pay these guys a lot of money, and the more desperation you have, the more you're willing to pay. And this would be where the desperation would happen, right? So it's definitely a really interesting thing. I think Notre Dame is a prime example of this. There are some really good offensive linemen in the Ivy Leagues, at the Group of 5 level, in the FCS level, that they could have gone out and gotten hypothetically in this transfer portal window after Jagusa went down. but they weren't able to. And that's not necessarily me arguing for that to happen, because frankly I do not at all want this to happen, but I do think it's a very interesting concept, and it's one that kind of opens up a number of different doors and kind of makes it a little bit more like the NFL, as we've kind of seen this develop over the last little bit. And kind of want to talk about a couple of different things that really factor into this and really kind of jump into this equation the most. And the biggest one that always jumps out whenever we have a number of these conversations is, what is the school factor in all of this? Where are we deciding when these kids are going to go to class, and how is transferring in the middle of August going to work for a kid that's trying to get into another university? That's probably the biggest hurdle here, because the reality is there's very, very few people that are going to be able to transfer on, let's say, August 3rd and be able to enroll by August 15th to take their classes. There's just no world where that happens. So that's definitely going to be a big roadblock here, but frankly, they've been able to get over a number of different roadblocks that had to do with school, but that's a total side argument. And then at the end of the day, it is football. It is a game where you go out on the field and there is a world where you get really injured. There is a world where some things go really, really poorly and you have a injury that really hurts you for quite some time. And I think that's the overarching kind of theme of this is, you obviously want these teams to be as well equipped as they possibly can be. You obviously want these teams to be in a position to put the best team out there every single Saturday. And in a world where we could have no injuries, I am signing up 10 times out of 10. That would be incredible, and it would be an incredible thing to watch because the best team would win every year, hypothetically. But at the end of the day, this is football. They are going to hit each other really hard in pretty much every single play, and injuries are going to happen. And frankly, it's one of the things that, I don't love injuries by any means, but the idea of a championship team overcoming a couple of injuries to find their way to glory, like 2014 Ohio State, there's no world where that happens today, because there's no world where they have 3 quarterbacks that are fully ready to go, and on top of that, they don't have a running back like Ezekiel Elliott. But that's a totally side point. I do think it's one of those things where being ready, making sure that you have your 2 and 3 deep guys ready. And yeah, it's about to be a little bit harder with the roster cap that's going to be put into place, but that's the job. It is football. It's going to be dangerous. You're going to have injuries no matter what team you are, no matter how incredible the player is. There's a world where they get injured, and you got to make sure you have a person to replace them. So although you hate injuries and you never want them to happen, they are a part of this game, and they are a part of the game that kind of separates the elite teams from the teams that have a good starting roster. And it's not necessarily to say that the starting roster teams are bad by any means, but being deep is the biggest part of the sport going forward. And I think, adding a portal window in August would be one of those things that it's a get out of jail free card for a lot of these teams that maybe have those injuries. And it's unfair, no doubt about it. Injuries are never fair to the guy that gets injured. But at the end of the day, a team like, let's say, Georgia, being able to go out and grab someone with 1 million, I'm throwing numbers out there. Let's go with Texas, because that was a example we had earlier. They could go out and throw, $1 million at one of the top running backs in the group of 5 level. He's taking that money. There's no two ways about that. He is walking out the door. He is finding his way to Texas, and I think that adds a very, very weird element to this. And I understand a lot of this is free agency. I understand that that's the way things go. But the second that we start creating a calendar that doesn't even kind of fit around the school calendar, then we have a problem. Frankly, we're already pretty far down that line at this point, but at least with the transfer portals that we have in place, they come, in between semesters, after semesters. It gives you an ability to enroll and get into classes at another university. This wouldn't. Just plain and simple, this wouldn't, or at least to the degree that they need to be. So overall, I understand that school is not the biggest part of this conversation, and it hasn't been for a very long time. It should be. That doesn't change the fact that it should be, and it absolutely is something that we need to put more energy into going forward. So I think it's one of those things that you talk about college football and you talk about how far it's moving forward and how many things are changing throughout this time, but it is still football. There are still injuries, there are still big hits, and it still creates a very interesting conversation for a lot of these teams where do you have the depth to handle a lot of the issues that are coming your way? Do you have 2 and 3 deep, and can you do it with the 105 players that you have at your disposal? So it's definitely going to be an interesting conversation. I think it's one of those things that you'd be hard pressed to get these coaches to agree to this, I would bet. But at the end of the day, if enough big time teams have enough big time injuries, there are things that can happen. And I'll leave it at that for the time being, because I don't like, entertaining this idea, because I hate this idea. But at the end of the day, it is one of those things that can happen. It is one of those things that a door can be opened at any moment where, a big-time player, Quinn Ewers, Carson Beck, whoever it is, goes down early in the season and you don't have a backup ready to play. There's a world where someone gets in some room and does some things in that negotiation to make sure that this ends up happening. Now, I'm not necessarily saying you got to hold your breath. I'm not necessarily saying this is on the horizon, but as we all know, if something is put out into the universe even a little bit, there's always a world where it happens in the college football realm, because money is a good thing. But at the end of the day, let's just keep moving on here. Let's take our second break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about a couple of playoff hypotheticals. We're going to get into 5 more today. We had 5 yesterday if you want to go check that out, but definitely a lot of very interesting ones on today. So we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.